You think an Airbnb is just a home away from home? Stay with me. These 3 nights changed that for me in ways I still can't explain. Story 1. The Mountain Cabin. I took that trip for silence. A week in a rented cabin upstate, the kind of place you book when the city feels loud and your head needs elbow room. The listing showed a wraparound deck, pine trees, a wood stove. No neighbors for what felt like miles. I told myself I wanted solitude to finish a project, to think. The drive up was the kind of empty that loosens you. Trees and sky, a single 2-lane road that led to a gravel driveway and a single porch light. The host met me at the gate, handed me a key and said, "If you need anything, call." His voice was casual, friendly. He pointed out the path to the river and the best place to watch the sunset. Everything was ordinary. Everything was calm. The first morning I went for a run. Cold air, frost rime the grass, the kind of quiet that sits on your chest. There was a feeling, though, not panic, just a small pulse of being watched. I told myself it was the trees, that the mind gets jumpy alone. A deer stamped through the underbrush, and I laughed out loud at myself. I took a picture of the river and sent it to a friend. "Perfect place to think," I wrote. I didn't tell anyone that every time I turned, I felt the sense of being observed. That night I locked the door 3 times, checked the sliding glass with my shoulder, set 2 mugs on the counter as if that made the place more human. I fell asleep to the faint tick of the wood stove and the occasional creak that old houses have. In the middle of the night I woke to a scrape. Not loud, a small noise near the kitchen, the kind of sound you file away if you're with other people, but that widens your pupils when you're alone. I sat up, heart moving faster, and listened. The house breathed around me. I told myself it was mice. I told myself the floorboards expanded. I lay there until dawn turned the room blue. 2 nights in, after a long day of working and then an awkward dinner of canned soup, I decided to step outside for a smoke. The back deck faced a dark stretch of forest, and the moon was thin. I leaned against the railing and watched the smoke thread up into the night like a white flag. The phone showed I'd missed a couple of emails. I clicked through them, and when I looked up, a shape moved across the kitchen window. Not a deer, a human silhouette, standing there by the counter like he'd been in the house for hours. I rose so hard my joints ached, my throat went dry. I told myself to call the police, to call the host. I did neither. Instead, I put out the cigarette and went inside like I was trying to be normal, to appear calm. I flicked on the kitchen light. No one. A mug off the drying rack was on the counter, where it had been when I'd left it. A cupboard door hung slightly open, but I'd left it closed. The back door was locked. My hands shook so badly I could feel it when I dialed 911. The operator's voice was steady, the kind that tries to make you breathe. They said an officer would be there soon. I told them about the silhouette. I told them about the broken-in feeling. I tried to be practical. I checked every room, peering into closets and under beds. Everything appeared as it had when I'd turned out the lights. Still, there was this presence, like someone had been here and left but would find his way back. The police did a drive-by and knocked on the door. Nothing. They told me to lock the doors and call if anything else happened. The host texted later, "We've had a bear around. Did you leave the back door?" He gave me tips about raccoons. I felt ridiculous. I wanted to believe his explanation. I wanted to believe I was being dramatic. I thought about leaving at dawn, but stayed. People in small towns are kind, and the host's messages were polite. I told myself I was safe. Sleep is a negotiation. You bargain with fear and hope the deal holds. That night I got up to smoke again. It was late. I stepped outside, pulled the cigarette to my lips, and heard the kitchen light click on behind me. The back door didn't swing. It moved with someone inside. A shadow crossed the window. I felt every hair on my arms stand up. This time I didn't walk in. I stayed on the stoop and watched the light through the curtains. Then the screen door slid open and a long-haired man stepped into the kitchen. He was unremarkable and terrible all at once. Beard, a jacket, those slow movements people make when they assume they're home. He moved like he belonged. The coffee maker hissed. He started to walk toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. My mouth closed around the cigarette like a vice. I didn't think. Logic evaporated into muscle memory. I slammed the front door shut. My hands fumbled for the deadbolt. He heard me. His voice, when it came, was low and thick with something I couldn't name. "It's okay," he said, like he was consoling an old friend. "I didn't mean to scare you." His footfalls came closer. My phone was in my back pocket. I dialed 911 with shaking hands and whispered into the line, "Someone's in my house." I moved toward the nearest bedroom and pushed the door closed. I slid the bolt and pressed my back against the wood. He was there on the other side. He rattled the handle before he started talking. Soft stuff at first, the kind of nonsense people say when they test your defenses. "I came back," he said. I love you." It could have been a confession. It could have been a lie. The knob shook. He put his shoulder into the door. The frame groaned. I pressed my feet into the floor and stared at the ceiling, listening to the noise of wood and breath and fear. He started to bang harder now. A voice that had been calm went thin and loud. "You can't lock me out of my life," he said. The banging turned into thumps, hard, hateful beats against something imagined as fragile. The phone in my hand felt like hot coal. I whispered to the dispatcher, told them where I was, told them my name. Their voice said to stay where I was, that help was on the way. I could hear the sirens in the distance, and then silence. Then the banging accelerated. At some point, he began to tell me things about the host, strange, specific things I hadn't known. Later, the host told me, indefinido, that the man had been an ex-fiancé, and that he sometimes came by. I couldn't tell if that was fact, or the host trying to make sense of something that didn't have to be sensible. All I knew in that moment was the pounding at my door and the small, terrible awareness that whoever was outside had weapons. Indefinido. I couldn't confirm it myself at first. The banging turned into slamming. The door edge splintered. Dust fell like snow in my hair. I remember thinking about nothing and everything at once. The absurdity of my phone's battery life, whether the window curtains would hide me, how people talk about things in movies, and how rarely real life matches that cadence. I thought of my inbox, of the project I'd come to finish, of the phone call I never made to my mother. I replayed conversations, tiny decisions. Should I have stayed in a hotel? I felt a wash of shame that I'd let myself be alone in a place with an unlocked history. The police arrived with a crash of voices and flashing lights. I heard them outside. "Police! Come out with your hands up!" Words that both commanded and promised. I heard a different kind of commotion. Boots, a scuffle, a shouted name. The banging stopped. There was a sense of movement that blurred into the background noise of the night. Metal clanging, footsteps, the sound of someone being wrestled to the earth. A voice, someone's, yelled, "Hands behind your head!" And then the high crack of a taser or restraint. I never asked. They were at the door, officers jostling with a man who sounded like he was resisting not out of bravery, but raw confusion. The officer who walked in after told me to stay put, to let them do their job. He had that calm urgency that people with guns get when the world asks them to fix what's broken. They cuffed him on the lawn. He wasn't a monstrous figure. He looked ordinary, which is what made it worse. Indefinido. Later, the host said the man had been hiding in a closet. I remember seeing him on the porch with a jacket torn and a knife. There were knives, the officers said. That detail came later, relayed through the officers' clipped sentences, and eventually confirmed by hospital reports and the host. I file it as part of the thing that happened, but the memory that sticks is small. The man on the porch staring up at me like he could not compute why I was alive. They led him away in cuffs. I sat on the kitchen floor and let the house's breath settle around me. My hands were shaking for hours. The officer put a blanket around my shoulders and asked routine questions. Someone offered water. The host arrived, pale and shaken, a phone in his hand. He apologized in a way that made me feel both pity and anger. His information about the man being an ex indefinido felt like something that should have been said earlier. "He used to come by," the host said. "I didn't think—" He trailed off. I wanted to pound my fist, but I didn't have the energy. I wanted to ask why his ex-fiancée had been hiding in a closet, why knives were in his jacket, why I had been the one to find him. The questions stacked up like unpaid bills. After they cleared the scene, officers took statements and photographed the damage. There was glass on the porch, scuff marks on the door, a small piece of wood splintered from my bedroom frame. They told me not to stay alone that night. Neighbors had been called by other officers in the area. Someone offered to drive me to a motel. I chose instead to sit in the car for a while, keys in hand, like a person who had mislaid the plot of a story they'd thought they knew. In the days after, the host told me details that made my stomach drop, that he'd known vulnerabilities, that he'd had a messy breakup, that he regretted not saying more. He told me, indefinido, that knives had been found in the man's jacket. He told me that the man had said strange things. I just wanted to be home. And that home meant different things to different people. The official police report used clinical language: trespass, detention, assaultive behavior. The reality, the messy, small, human reality, was that someone had been inside my rented house the way a ghost occupies a photograph, unquestioned, familiar, and utterly wrong. The aftermath lodged itself in me like a splinter. I stopped taking late-night walks. I double-checked locks so many times my hands began to strain. I caught myself listening for steps around the house, even after I'd moved back. I replayed every ordinary decision that had led me there. Smoking on the deck, trusting the host, choosing a cheap, pretty listing. Survivor guilt has an odd architecture. It doesn't always follow danger. Sometimes it creeps in as gratitude and then turns sharp. I would catch my reflection in a window and feel like a different person, someone who had been watched and had learned very quickly what that felt like. If there's one small, absurd thing I still think about, it's the cigarette. How trivial actions can thread into fate. I tell people sometimes with a kind of dry laugh that masks what it really feels like. I almost left because of a raccoon. It's a sentence meant to make sense of randomness. It doesn't. If you thought that was the worst of it, wait. That was only the beginning. If this is the kind of thing you come for, hit subscribe. I'm sharing the second story next, and it's the kind that makes the hairs on your neck stand up. Story 2, The Red Car at 11:33. A few months later, I took another trip. This one shorter, a stopover after an interview. I wasn't looking for solitude. I was looking for a cheap, safe place to crash before my early flight. The host was gracious, a code to get in, a promise of early check-in, a picture of a tidy living room. The apartment was in a quiet neighborhood, the street punctuated by mailboxes and neatly trimmed hedges. I brought a small suitcase, a laptop, and the weary optimism of someone trying to convince themselves everything is fine. I checked in, left my bags by the sofa, and went out for a celebratory coffee that tasted like the city's nothing special that isn't special. It was a late afternoon that smelled like rain. The apartment was modest but clean. A plant drooped on the sill, and the TV remotes were lined up like punctuation marks on the armrest. I remember thinking how normal it felt to live in someone else's life for a night, how you borrow chairs, bathrooms, the way light falls through blinds. Around 11:33 p.m. the doorbell rang. Who rings a bell at 11:33 p.m.? The number 11:33 stuck in my head afterward like an alarm. I hesitated by the door, the echo of the bell still in my bones. I looked through the peephole and saw a skinny man, a brown paper bag crumpled under his arm, like he was holding something that wanted to be the center of attention. He wore a cap pulled low. He called out, "Pizza!" and his voice fit the role, hopeful, rehearsed. I thought maybe the host had allowed late orders. I checked the app. No recent deliveries on my account. I told myself it was likely nothing. Still, there's a twang of discomfort that doesn't go away when you see faces at your door in the small hours. I kept the chain on. I slid the door enough to show my face and left the chain hooked. He smiled and held up the brown bag like a gift. "Hey man, pizza?" He said it like he belonged on a street where people left tips on stoops. His smile was quick, practiced. He asked if there were other people in the apartment, if the host had mentioned anyone staying. He asked things that didn't need to be asked. I told him no, said my name and not my life. I told him I didn't order anything. He shrugged, like a man who expected these little bluffs. He looked at the street, and I saw him glance at a car parked across the way, a red sedan with a busted headlight that sat with its engine idling, smoke curling faintly from that one broken lamp. It didn't have a license plate clipped on the front. He said, "That's my ride," and laughed as if that explained anything. He left the bag on the step and walked away, but never left the block. He went to the driver's window and knocked, and the red car hummed like a beast waiting for a cue. I remember feeling oddly exposed. The chain felt like a promise that could be undone. I told him to leave the bag and go. He hesitated, then walked off. The red car rolled a little and then stopped. I locked the door and sat on the couch with my back to the TV. The bag sat on the welcome mat like a question mark. I could have called the host then. I could have called the police. Instead, I texted the host. Someone left a bag at the door. No idea who. He replied, "Maybe pizza. Leave it." His tone was casual, and I supposed he assumed it was an innocent delivery. I supposed a lot of things. After that, the night rattled with small things. The doorbell rang 3 more times, each a quiet, sudden punctuation at 11:44, midnight, and 12:17. Each time I opened the chain just enough to see the same thin man in different hats, the same smile, the same brown bag. He never stayed, he never pounded. He never shoved his way into the frame of the doorway. He merely tested the threshold like a cat rubbing a door. The red car, my mind kept going back to it. I crept to the window and watched it sit at the end of the block, its broken headlight like a blind eye. Sometimes it moved forward and then idled. Sometimes it wasn't there at all. People leave cars. People park awkwardly. But there's a different kind of dread when the same car appears at odd hours near rent-a-home after an attempt to gain contact has been made. It felt like a thing out of movies where plot lines hinge on one green light. I tried to be rational. Maybe the man worked for a pizza place that pulls odd routes. Maybe the car belonged to someone who lived in a nearby building. Maybe my own nervousness, heightened by what happened at the cabin, was giving this a sinister soundtrack. But anxiety doesn't always invent evidence. The body notices patterns. I noticed pattern after pattern. The man would ring, and the car would idly orbit. He would leave a bag on the step and then stand at the curb, as if he expected someone to come out and take it. Once, when I peeked through the blinds, I saw him look into the window, long enough to feel like an intrusion. He didn't knock. He simply stood and watched. The feeling of being seen tightened into a knot. I tried to sleep. I dozed in fits, waking every time the house made a noise. Around 3:50 a.m., I woke to footsteps that were too deliberate for a house that shouldn't have had anyone else inside. My door chain was engaged, but the door itself was slightly ajar. I remember that sensation like a spear, how there's an instant when your brain fills every blank with the worst case. The bag that had been an annoyance when it first arrived now lay on the floor in the entryway, crumpled open like a joke whose punchline is a question. I walked toward it and the smell hit me. Nothing particularly sinister, just stale takeout and cold cardboard. Inside, paper cups, napkins, a few slices gone. The bag had been tampered with, but nothing was missing that I could tell. However, the front door being open while the chain was still hooked felt like a logic error. Someone had tested the chain, someone who knew how to move without making noise. I looked out the window toward the street. The red car was there, its headlight a dull glare, engine idling like before. No one was in sight. It seemed like someone had left it to watch, like it was sleeping with one eye open. It wasn't until later that I realized I had made a choice that would sit with me. I didn't call 911. I debated it for a long time, maybe an hour, and told myself I would leave in the morning. Part of that hesitation is inertia. Part of it is that most nights with oddities end without incident. You learn to be economical with your fear. You save it for real emergencies, or so you tell yourself. I bolted the door again and slept with my phone on my chest, thumb hovering over the screen like it could be an answer. I remember thinking, in a dry, exhausted way, that I had become someone who checked outside before every door opening. That little ritual protects you in small increments. Morning came with the grey light of an overcast day. The red car wasn't there. The bag was still on the mat, now cold and unnoticed. The host texted, "Sorry about the late orders. Neighborhood kids sometimes joke." He invited me to stay longer if my flight was delayed. His tone was the same as it had been, practical, distant. I felt like I was a figure in a play whose lines were polite speech and whose cues were unease. I left that apartment with my bag heavier than when I arrived. I kept replaying the man at the door, the red car at the curb, the way the chain had been tested but not broken. Was it sinister? Was it a fluke? The host later said, indefinido, that there had been some weird folks in the area lately. The listing was removed a week after I stayed. The host never answered my questions about whether he'd reported the car or the man. I told myself the police probably had their reasons, and that sometimes things remain indefinido because they are. I told a friend about it later, almost laughing because humor is a shield. He told me to be careful. I told him he was right, and that was the end of that conversation. But the thing that stayed with me wasn't a broken headlight or a brown bag. It was the sense that someone had been studying the threshold between public and private, the ambivalence about whether a knock at 11:33 p.m. is a belly laugh or a threat. It was the notion that a red car could be a plot and a parking violation at the same time. I had plans to leave for a trip after that. Your life keeps moving, even when your mind is stuck on a streetlight. But when I got that next rental confirmation, I kept thinking about the red car at the end of the block, waiting, idling, patient. I kept thinking about how easy it is to create a setup and not deliver a punchline, about how people leave coincidences loose like threads that can be pulled. I didn't realize then that the worst was still coming. The pattern, odd signs, small intrusions. A strange car was a motif. It repeats across stories because it's the kind of detail people miss until it turns into something else. The man that night never forced his way in. He never attempted anything violent while I was there. But absence of violence is not the same as safety. It is a margin of chance. That night left me with a kind of practiced vigilance. I began to notice details I had ignored before: how many cars park on an empty street, if porch lights flicker, who walks past at odd hours. The red car had taught me that threat can be a slow, patient thing. It can sit at the curb and wait, silent, uncomplicated. If the thought of a man leaving a bag at your door unsettles you, brace yourself. The third story is worse. If you thought the first two had you covered in dread, the last one will change the baseline. My family thought we were safe. We were wrong. I wish I could say I had a clear, rational reason to feel the way I do now, but often there are no tidy explanations, only the echo of footsteps and the knowledge that one night someone decided to knock. I found myself counting small vulnerabilities differently after that night. I checked windows twice. I left lights on in rentals. I stopped trusting maybe it's nothing as a defense. You get better at noticing, which is both a skill and a sentence. The sun was still up when I left that second rental, but the memory of 11:33 lived in me like a bruise. I tried to forget it. I failed. The next trip was supposed to be for laughter and sand and cheap seafood, a family vacation with my wife and 2 kids. We wanted the ocean and a house with a porch and nothing more complicated than board games in the evening. We wanted normal. We wanted simple. We didn't get either. And yet, before I tell you what happened, know this. What followed wasn't the product of one odd man or one parked car. It was a sequence. It was escalation. It was people finding a way into a house where small margins of error, an unlocked sliding door, a child who saw something in the yard, became the fault lines of a much larger fear. I still see my son's face the day he told us he'd seen something near the creek. He said, "They waved." I wish he'd never said it. Story 3. The House by the Sea. We drove in a tired chorus of, "Are we there yet?" and the kind of laughter that only comes when everyone's already half asleep. My wife had found the place online, a simple rental, a block from the beach, with a wide porch and a short path to a creek that wound into the dunes. We wanted cheap, close, uncomplicated. Our son was 8 then, forever armed with a puddle of Legos in his backpack and a wild imagination. Our daughter, 13, wanted nothing more than to disappear into her phone and emerge only for snacks. The listing pictures promised a porch swing, a board game shelf, and a kitchen with a sunbeam at noon. The host's messages were friendly and timely. It felt small and ordinary, and that's the kind of background piece people mistake for safety. The first day was exactly what we wanted. Sand in shoes, cheap fried seafood, the kids building a lopsided sandcastle. The house sat back from the road behind scrubby grass and a stand of low trees near the creek. We joked about the wildlife as we unloaded. Raccoons, rabbits, maybe a lonely heron. At night, we left a porch light on because the kids were still used to coming in late from backyard adventures. And there was comfort in a lighted rectangle against the dark. On the second evening, my son came to bed earlier than usual. He climbed into our bed like a small, soft storm and whispered, "Dad, there were people by the creek." He said it quietly, as if the words themselves could be contagious. He told us they'd been wearing masks and that they'd waved. My wife and I glanced at each other in the half-dark. We both smiled the way exhausted parents do when they're not sure whether they're about to soothe or interrogate. "Maybe it was kids," my wife said, the explanation ready and practical. "Kids in costumes, playing." Our daughter rolled over and pretended to sleep. We didn't send anyone out to look. We agreed, without a moment's dramatic discussion, that the ocean brings odd people at dusk, teenagers, costume tourists, pranksters. That was the sensible take. We made a plan to be more watchful, and I remember thinking that watchfulness felt polished and adult, like tightening a seatbelt. The small worry lodged in the back of my throat, the way a splinter sits, annoying but manageable. That night, because of the creaky floors and the tiny flashlight the kids begged for, we decided to camp in the living room. Blankets, sleeping bags, the television doing half its job with cartoons that blurred into the sound of waves. We turned everything down low and pretended the whole arrangement was special. A family campout. It was supposed to be reassuring. The porch light hummed and made the sliding glass door a dark mirror with a sliver of the outside world pressed against it. We all fell somewhere between light sleep and a doze. I remember the muffled rhythm of the house, the refrigerator practicing its low purr, a distant gull, the slow exhale of the heating system. Somewhere after 2 in the morning, the house got thinner, the way sound does when you lean out a window and try to hear a street 3 blocks away. Then a noise stepped forward, something on the other side of the glass. At first it was nothing more than a shadow. Then 3 shadows. 3 figures standing very close to the sliding door, pressed together like they were testing the surface between outside and in. They were hooded, all in black, shapes I couldn't read at first. Then they turned faces toward us, and the mask showed a single grotesque white eye, bulging, blank, cartoonish in a way that made my skin crawl. The masks looked like something made for a haunted house. In the low light, they were suddenly pointing accusations. One of them tapped the glass with a slow finger. Another waved, an oddly casual, mocking sort of wave. The third lifted something that caught the porch light and glinted. A blade, the way one sees a reflection and knows instinctively to look again. It wasn't a long blade. It was the kind of knife someone keeps for cutting boxes, but up close and visible in a moonlit yard, it acquired the bad intent of every horror movie prop. I remember the children's small, panicked breaths and how quick and thin they became. My daughter was the first to move. She grabbed my wife's arm and whispered into her sleeve, "Call 911. Her voice was bright with that urgent clarity teenagers sometimes have. Too old for childish fears, too young to dilute the fear with practice. I were on my feet before my brain fully accepted the situation. My hands found a walking stick by instinct. Some relic from a neighborhood walk that was now our makeshift spear. I looked through the blinds, and they were there. 3 black silhouettes framed by the porch's smeared light. Their masks had eyes that didn't blink. One of them placed the blade flat against the handle of the sliding door and pushed, testing the resistance. The latch held. The second drew closer to the corner of the door and pressed the sole of a sneaker against the metal frame as if to find a weakness. Everything slows in a specific cinematic way when your family is in danger. The cartoon on the TV faded to a colorless smear. The air seemed to condense around my mouth. I remember thinking of small, stupid things. The card game left on the coffee table, my son's green toothbrush in the bathroom. Thinking about items is sometimes a way the brain tries to anchor, to prove that this is still the same house where ordinary things live. "Stay down," I told them, my voice thinner than I'd have liked. "Call now, don't make noise." My wife had the phone already, fingers precise and practiced. My daughter had slid into the couch and covered our son with a blanket. The man with the blade pressed harder, and my knees remembered 100 half-remembered self-defense videos, and nope, none of them were helpful right then. I stood and held the walking stick like a coward and a father at the same time. I stepped toward the glass. That was a terrible decision in one light, and the only rational one in another. If they were trying to intimidate us into opening, showing fear would be fuel. If they wanted to take a chance with knives, broadcasting a willingness to stand our ground might be a deterrent. I could see all the possible outcomes like doors in a hall I didn't want to walk down. He pushed on the sliding door again, this time harder. The blade scraped, the handle rattled. A voice, muffled, distorted by the glass, said something that sounded like a taunt. The masks made the voices tinny and theatrical. "Come out," someone said. "We just want to play." My daughter had dialed 911. The operator's voice was a ribbon pulling calm through the chaotic sound. "Stay on the line, sir," she said. "Help is on the way. Can you confirm any weapons?" I didn't look away from the door. "Yes," I said, my mouth dry. "One with a knife." One of the masked figures put his face close to the glass, like he wanted to measure us by sight. He tapped once, twice, almost lazily. Then he slapped the glass in a harsh, sharp sound. My son cried out. The nice, ordinary bubble of the trip popped and scattered like a dropped glass marble. I did something I am not proud of. I opened the blinds a sliver and fixed my stare on them. I wanted them to see what they were doing. Not a family in pajamas, not an easy mark. I wanted them to see me, to register an adult in the room who could be unpredictable. For a dreadful second they seemed to recede as if startled by the refusal to be frightened. The one with the blade raised his hand, as if deciding whether to escalate. He tapped the glass slowly, then withdrew the knife as if to make a demonstration. My wife's voice was a quiet machine behind me. Names, addresses, the sound of someone who has practiced what to say. She whispered our location into the line. The operator repeated the words like an incantation. Help is on the way. Then that same dreadful pause. Sirens in the distance, muffled at first, then getting closer and sharper. One of them reached and grabbed the sliding door handle. He pulled. The latch scraped and squealed. The handle gave a small grating complaint. For a moment I thought it would hold. Then the second figure struck the glass with something blunt, and the structure of the door shivered. It made a sound like someone breaking the back of a book. I could hear the glass flex under pressure. The neighbor across the way stepped into the light, someone who had heard the noise and decided not to ignore it. A porch light clicked on with a sharp, attentive sound. The masked figures glanced over. For a beat, they hesitated. The blade figure's hand trembled. And then everything accelerated. The glass didn't shatter cleanly. It spidered and then parted enough for a hand to wedge through. One of them slipped his arm into the opening and worked the lock. The door popped. There was a sliver. And then they were in the threshold, their dark shapes cutting into the living room's thin circle of light. I remember the sound of my daughter's scream, thin and brittle, the kind that feels like a match struck in your chest. My wife moved forward as fast as she could, without exposing the kids. I swung the walking stick. I didn't aim to harm, I aimed to buy space, to create a moment where their plan would fog and their decision would meet resistance. They were bold in a way that makes you suspect rehearsal. One of them reached for my children's blankets and yanked them away as if to test reactions. Another grabbed for the game board on the coffee table and flung it aside. The one with the knife stepped forward with an odd, almost playful motion, like a person showing off a dangerous prop at a party. I thrust the stick at him and it hit his forearm. He hissed but didn't back down. He pushed, and for a breathless instant I felt the raw animal of danger, not in a movie way, but as a hot, very precise sensation in the pit of my body. Then the flashing lights cut the night into strips of blue and red. The masked figures froze, like actors caught mid-step. A voice boomed, authoritative, human. "Police! Drop the weapons!" It came from two sets of shouted commands, close and decisive. The neighbor had called, someone else had called. The thudding of boots on the porch blurred with the sound of a car door slamming. One of them bolted for the yard, a dark comet across the lawn. Two of them turned toward the back, but then they saw the patrol cars converge, and the idea of easy escape dissolved into panic. The officers moved with that efficient clarity that training gives people. Shouted orders, confident motions, hands on holsters. I heard running, the scurry of shoes on grass, the breathing of men and women who were suddenly a force in our private world. A cop tackled one of them near the fence. The impact thudded. The neighbor who had stood on his porch suddenly had a role. He shouted directions, held a flashlight. Two of the figures tried to use the trees as cover and then found themselves hemmed by uniformed officers. There was a momentary chaotic scramble, hands grasping for shoes, bodies bumping a sandbox, the scrape of a mask coming loose. One came toward the house again in a last reckless attempt, but officers were on him before he reached the front step. Commands were repeated, sharp and fast. "Get on the ground! Hands where we can see them!" The masks came off in the scuffle. Faces young and not unrecognizable, ordinary and terrible. I don't pretend to know the exact sequence of legal outcomes. What I do know is what happened in the living room and on our lawn. Two were detained almost immediately. One was tackled as he tried to run. One of them had a small knife in his pocket. The other had something like a box cutter. Police cuffed hands and read rights in that flat procedural tone that makes the whole event feel like a news clip. They were taken into custody, brought to their knees on our grass, breath clouding in the cold air. Someone later told us that neighbors had seen people moving around the creek at odd hours for weeks, that tourists had been targets for small gangs looking for thrills. The officers said they'd seen patterns, groups that liked to scare people, sometimes escalating to robbing or worse. The official words were clinical: apprehended, detained, charges pending, but the shape of the moment was still jagged. I tried not to watch them as they were led away. They weren't monsters in the mythic sense. They were young, messy, and terrifyingly normal. In the hours after, the house smelled like the breath of bodies and the dampness of the sea. Neighbors came by, polite and worried. The kids were small wrecks of adrenaline and relief, trembling and clinging. The officers asked questions, wrote things down with clipboards and pens that made the whole world feel formal and oddly small. They took statements, took photographs, and said the things that are necessary. You're safe now. We'll stay in touch. We'll work on statements. They offered to contact the host and to make sure we had somewhere to stay. Someone offered hot coffee. Another neighbor offered blankets. The aftermath didn't arrive all at once. It came like a tide. In the immediate hours, we were buoyed by the presence of people who knew how to do the work of responding. But the next days were the harder part, the slow settling. The kids had nightmares. My son refused to walk by the creek for weeks. He used to build tiny forts of sand, and now he mapped dangers in the grain of the beach like a cartographer of peril. My daughter started sleeping with a lamp on. My wife found herself waking at odd hours, listening for the kitchen sounds that used to be nothing but now were loaded with meaning. Neighbors told stories in whispers, that there'd been a small group targeting renters, that masks made of cheap plastic were bought for laughs and soon became tools for intimidation. People offered explanations that felt both relevant and insufficient. I could not shake the image of those white, bulging eye masks, so silly in design and so effective at dehumanizing. I couldn't reconcile the idea that something purchased at a novelty store could change a porch into a stage for terror. For weeks after, we felt raw. We moved with a kind of careful choreography. My wife checked locks 3 times before she would sleep. I carried a phone in my coat pocket like a talisman, and the kids learned to identify every missing sound from the house. We considered never going back. In the end, we never did. The rental listing was deactivated shortly afterward, whether by the host in the name of caution or because of pressure from the platform, indefinido. The police did their thing in their procedural way. The community said some of the suspects were local youths who liked to scare tourists. Legal outcomes followed their own path after I gave statements, and the officers filed reports. I don't have the final word on what happened to them beyond they were taken into custody and charges were being considered. What happened to the 3 masked people in that yard is partly resolved and partly indefinido. You can tell yourself that the officers arrived in time because they did. You can also tell yourself you were nearer to a tragedy than you knew because you were. Both are true. One of the arresting officers later said, "We were fortunate that the neighbors were vigilant and that someone called, that if the call had been delayed for minutes, things might have looked different." I file that sentence away with a flinch and a gratitude that is threaded with survivor logic, luck, timing, and a neighbor unwilling to pretend the night was ordinary. We left the area with our suitcases heavier than when we arrived. The kids tried to be stoic. They tried to make a joke about masks. Humor arrived as a defense, brittle and quick. On the drive home, I found myself watching the rearview mirror for anything that might follow. For a while after, I measured every house in terms of porches and escape routes, as if the world had rearranged its furniture in my head. Reflection came slowly. The common element in all 3 of these nights is not the knife or the red car or the man in the cabin. It's the sense that rented spaces, places we assume are temporary and therefore less charged with the history of violence, can become arenas for other people's problems, vendettas, or cruel entertainments. People used the fact that we were visitors, easier to scare, less likely to make waves, people who would leave quietly. That is a sobering thought. It isn't a moral indictment that you stayed or that you smoked on a porch. It's a reminder that safety is a fragile conversation between chance and preparation. After those months, I learned new habits. I don't share all of them because some are small rituals that are more about managing panic than improving safety. I do say this: vigilance isn't paranoia when it's practiced without assuming you can control everything. It is about recognizing the edges of a place and not pretending a lock is a guarantee. It's about neighbors answering phones and communities paying attention. It's about understanding that danger often arrives as an accumulation of small strangenesses. A knocked door, a bag on a mat, a red car idling with its headlight out. The long-term effects are quieter and slower than the adrenaline rush of a police siren. I still wake sometimes with a jolt, and I still count locks in my head like a litany. My wife checks the security lights. My son, now calmer at the beach, will still say, "Dad, remember the masks?" And I will say, "I remember." And both of us mean far more than the simple memory. My daughter keeps a little flashlight on her bedside table. We don't talk about moving on as if it's a destination. We talk about arranging our life so we can keep going. There are no tidy lessons that can guarantee safety every time you open an app and book a place. There are, at best, small practices. Check lighting. Know exit points. Let someone know your plans. Trust neighbors who watch the street. But the truth is more pedestrian and more chilling. People do bad things, sometimes for no reason you can understand, sometimes because they find it a thrill to terrorize strangers, sometimes because they are lost, young, or cruel. The majority of visits will be ordinary, maybe even lovely, but a handful will not be, and those handfuls can do a lot of damage to the sense of ordinary life. When I think about these 3 nights in sequence, the man in the cabin, the red car at 11:33, the masked figures at the sliding door, I see a through line that isn't just escalation for spectacle. It's the way ordinary margins get exploited. Hours when people are alone, thresholds left unguarded, hosts who may not fully disclose risks. It's the way our instinct to be polite and non-confrontational sometimes collides with other people's maliciousness. And it's the constant, weird human fact that the ones who survive stay with a new kind of knowledge that is both a burden and a shield. If you're watching this and you have a story, an Airbnb, a home rental, a motel, a hostel, where something felt off or went wrong, you are not alone. Share it below if you feel up to it. These are not tales meant to scare you into never traveling again. They are warnings and a call for communal attention. The platforms, the hosts and neighbors all play a role, but so do we, by noticing, by speaking up, and by demanding basic decency and accountability. I still travel. I still go to work trips and family trips and little weekend places. I do it differently. I don't pretend that's a guarantee. Nothing is a guarantee. But I also refuse to live in a boxed-off room made of fear. The best we can do is pack awareness with our toothbrushes and assume nothing is promised. If you got an Airbnb horror story or a strange rental experience, tell it in the comments. Share what you learned. Stay safe out there. And if this kept you on edge, consider subscribing. I post stories like this that track the small, unsettling ways ordinary nights can go very wrong and the ways people recover after.